Hello and welcome to A Call to Arms, a series of interviews discussing a range of issues relevant to defence with UK practitioners at the top of their profession. I'm Andy Young and I work for the Military Sciences Research Group here at the Royal United Services Institute on Whitehall. Each month, I will host an interview with a senior leader from within the UK Armed Forces, exploring the issues that face defence today and tomorrow, giving you the inside story on how the military orientates itself to face future challenges. This series is kindly supported by Airbus, a company that employs 12,500 people around the UK and contributes £7 billion to UK GDP. This month on A Call to Arms, we speak to Commander Mark Sparrow Royal Navy, Commanding Officer at 617 Squadron, the UK's first operational F-35 squadron. A fixed-wing pilot for over 20 years, Commander Sparrow has flown Sea Harriers, Harrier GF7s and 9s, FA-18s with the US Navy, and now F-35s. As a qualified weapons instructor, he has led tactical employment during operations in Afghanistan and on deployments both at sea and ashore. Commander Sparrow, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we go into the meat of the interview or discussion, could you just tell us a little bit about your role as CO617?
Absolutely. So I am very lucky and privileged to be in the position I am as a Royal Navy officer to be in command of the Royal Air Force's premier squadron, the Dambusters. I took over in 2020, just before, or about 12 months before the FORTIS deployment. And my role is, as officer commanding, ensuring that we are tactically ready as a squadron to go and meet whatever is required around the world. So it's been very exciting. It's been a hugely... if one was to want to take over a squadron as a Royal Navy officer, to take over just before Fortis and the maiden deployment of Queen Elizabeth was phenomenal, and to be involved in all of that. So I feel very lucky to be where I am today.
And of course, Fortis is, as you said, it's the maiden deployment. It's the first time we've got the F-35 to sea on an actual deployment rather than working up. And of course, the first part of the deployment, when you're in the Eastern Med, you're actually doing operations, which is a big thing to actually be leading. And just on that one, because you've obviously flown from carriers before, what was the experience of flying the F-35 from QE in comparison to flying from Illustrious or Invincible, say?
There are a huge amount of similarities, but in terms of the aircraft, clearly massive differences. The Sea Harrier was like wobbling around on the edge of a pinprick. This jet has got all the world's technology in it to help the pilot physically fly it. But the interesting part to it is I think everyone has the impression of F-35, oh, it's easy, you press buttons and it lands itself, etc. To a certain extent, true, definitely compared to the Harrier and the Sea Harrier. But it has its own challenges. Any aviation from an aircraft carrier is inherently risky business, as we saw towards the end of the deployment. And F-35 can still knock the unwary off their perch, if that makes sense, if they're not ready for it. So it's a wonder. I'm a Luddite in terms of technology, and that's terrible, isn't it, as a fifth generation CO? But the jet is phenomenal, and it constantly amazed me watching it in the hover. The 3BSM doing its magic behind, keeping the jet very, very stable. So it takes away a lot of that risk from pure boat flying, but the inherent risk of flying from the sea are always there, as they always have been.
I think that's a point that we often forget, and I did see a lot on Twitter, and I know we're going off topic slightly here, but I see a lot on Twitter of people going, hang on, let's just put the loss rate of aircraft flying in comparison to the historical precedent when you've got multiple aircraft, huge numbers of aircraft on deck, and these things, well, the early string bags literally held together by pieces of string.
Yeah.
So it is a vastly different, and actually when you look in historically, the loss rate is far less than anything previous. So the safety is much better. But one of the things that talking to Air Vice Marshal Turner and Vice Admiral Burns came out with, we were talking about the 80-20 synthetic live training mix. And obviously That's very different when you're at sea. But how did it play out on FORTIS, that mix between the synthetic and the live?
So in my time on the F-35 so far, it's been more of a 50-50 mix, but having synthetics on board the carrier was essential. Without the DMRT, deployed mission rehearsal trainers, on board, we wouldn't have been able to achieve a huge amount of what we did achieve. For example, so it's a slight misnomer, mission rehearsal trainer, and I think the genesis of that piece of equipment was, as it says in the name, there's a mission coming up, we're going to go and practice that mission. That's very hard to achieve. It's very easy to write down, very hard to have a piece of equipment that can actually do that representatively. However, the DMRT does allow us to tactically train. So there's a lot of things we can do in there that we can't do in the live environment, as well as your very basic currency and emergency handling. So, for example, when I used to go in a Harrier to Afghanistan, there was only a certain period of time you could be away before you had to come back and do an emergency simulator for basic safety reasons. So having the DMRT for that was exceptional. So we could just do that every month and just keep rolling through the basics, including landing on a normal runway. So obviously we're doing 8 months flying off a carrier. It'd be, if we had to divert, it'd be useful to remember how to land normally as well. So we did that. But the biggest takeaway was we were able to continue our generation of airborne leadership quals. So, for example, the pairs lead and 4-ship lead workups, they didn't stop because we still need a synthetic element to that for the reasons I said of why the DMRT is useful. We could have done entirely airborne, but they would have missed out elements because they wouldn't have had the full package. So we were able to get the airborne part of it as well as the synthetic while we were away. So things didn't stop because we were away for 8 months. But from that respect, so I'm absolutely I'm a strong believer in the synthetic element of it. However, there is so much you get in the live environment that the simulator just does not replicate. For example, all the issues with things just not quite working right. You need to live that, you need to breathe that, and with the benefits that the simulator brings on that side. So there's absolutely benefit in a mix of it.
That's really interesting, and I suppose that comes across if you extrapolate out into other areas of the armed forces and so on. That's absolutely right, and I've seen synthetic training how it's benefited, but you never get the same experience as you do when you're actually flying properly. I suppose there's that grounding basis of, right, let's just prepare you, this is the sort of thing you're going to be dealing with. It's great, but you're never going to get that feel as you actually lift off in the same way. Of course, one of the great things about the synthetic piece is you're able to, and you said mission rehearse and so on and so forth, but that tactical evolution of the airframe and how you're going to operate in the air. Now, obviously, you were embarked with USMC, and they will fight the aircraft or the platform in a certain way. You guys will fight in a certain way. Did that mission rehearsal platform enable you to better sync, or was it all actually going forward up in the air?
So both synthetic and in the air was great, but again, to your point of working with VMFA 211, so the first time we worked with them was for Group X, which was back in September 2020. So they flew over to the UK, and we worked together for 2 weeks prior to embarking on the carrier. Then we embarked on the carrier for 4 to 5 weeks for Group X, came off and then took part in Crimson Warrior for a further 3 weeks on disembarkation as a combined unit, effectively, 211 and 617. And what really struck me was the fact that, unlike previous platforms, this platform, we all work to a common tactics manual. And that was evident from trip one when we flew together. We are talking the same language tactically in the air. So it's a lot more straightforward to embed instantaneously than it probably was in previous aircraft types, because US Marine Corps Harriers and Royal Air Force Harriers, Royal Navy Harriers would all have their own ways of doing things. And yeah, there was a big jump. Whereas when we are talking about DCA, for example, we're all talking the same terminology because we work off the same generic tactics manual. So actually the ability to interoperate is really straightforward in this jet, is good. But yeah, again, I think they found having the DMRT on board really, really useful as well, possibly more useful than they expected it to be for the same reasons as I've talked about.
That's really interesting, really, from a perspective of the idea of us, and Vice Admiral Burns talked about this, about aggregating, disaggregating, properly linking in with partners and the interoperability. And it's not just about exchange, it is true interoperability. So hearing that from your perspective, very much at the operational tactical level and the technical level as well, because that conceptual component's how you operate your doctrine, that's got to be really, really tight if you're going to operate across those seams. Now, one of the things that is often spoken about in terms of carrier sorties versus land sorties is the sortie rate. And I know that there was quite a bit of work done looking by the Corbett Centre, looking at sortie rate from RN flat tops versus sortie rate by ground-based forces or land-based air. In terms of what you've learned, because you've seen the evolution of 617 from its formation at Marham, what did you learn in terms of sortie rates, availability, etc., from FORTIS, and how will that inform future development, deployment workups, and force generation?
So in my lived experience of the last 18 months, including group sail and the other times we've been on the carrier, we had a really good AVA for a shortish period. By shortish, I mean probably the beginning of FORTIS, the first 6 to 8 weeks were really, really good and way above anything that we were able to achieve back at RAF Marham. Why is that? Because we have the whole team on the ship. We are bounded by where we are. We have the supplies ready to go on the ship. However, I don't think you can compare the two because they are two completely different beasts. And as we saw, so when I say that, I mean land-based and maritime. It's not a, well, we always need to go to sea because that'll be better because you have a better sortie rate, or I always need to be at land for the same reasons. What we saw on FORTIS, and one of the many learning points that will come out of it.
No, it does. And I mean, it poses further questions, which I suppose comes into, and again, I'll go back to a discussion that I had with Vice Admiral Burns, which is looking at the infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And if I'm thinking in terms of the infrastructure, back in the good old, bad old days, we had coaling stations, which were naval bases that you could have all of those things pre-deployed, pre-positioned. Today, we're not in that same space. So I suppose then, with things like the OPVs being forward deployed, with that, we'll get that turn through. That will have an impact which will benefit yourselves because we'll get better at that pre-positioning infrastructure piece. And one of the things I know previously that they were looking at was the 3D printing of parts. And I'm guessing that that's not really possible with the F-35.
I don't know enough about it, but I guess it's an evolving capability. But we couldn't just whip up a part at the moment for all the reasons you can imagine. So, but in terms of forward basing, I mean, it was interesting that when we set up on FORTIS, we obviously knew, from my perspective, there was a real risk we would never get off the aircraft carrier because we'd seen the US carriers in the previous 6 months deploying for 7 months and not getting off because of COVID and all the things that happened on their carriers prior. The fact that we were able to make stops was fantastic. The biggest eye opener for me was Guam out in the Pacific. So that was genuinely a lifesaver that we were able to get there for a good 2-week period. But it'll be interesting to see. That's a very well-found base from a US perspective, US Navy and US Air Force. But what a great location out in that part of the world.
I suppose that comes really to the final part of it, but the final part of this picture. Got the structures in place, we've got the vision of, and I mean, all kudos to the Joint Strike Fighter, to the F-35, to the Queen Elizabeth, and so on. We've gone on a journey over the last 10 years of actually regaining carrier strike, having lost it, and you've lived that whole experience. But of course, part of the whole lived experience at sea is very alien to those who potentially have not lived that experience, both Navy and RAF. So how did that lived experience really match or meet expectations for the squadron when it was deployed and its attendant personnel? Because we had Royal Air Force Police come out as well, obviously.
Yeah.
So how did that?
So, yeah, I mean, in my time in the Royal Navy, I've never deployed for that period of time in one go. Definitely not on an aircraft carrier. I don't believe there's an RAF squadron that's done it in living memory for that period of time. On top of that, we're in a generation now where actually even Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm personnel are not that used to going to sea, compared to where they would have been 30 years ago, something like that. So it is the RAF personnel clearly, but the Royal Navy as well. So the whole team, I think there was probably one or two people on my entire squadron that had been away on a carrier for that period of time. So, and not me. So it was new for me as well. I was very, very aware of the challenges. We mentioned COVID briefly. My biggest fear that no one would get off. Morale-wise, that would have been a dark place. We did experience COVID on board the carrier post Cyprus for effectively the remainder of the deployment, and that was extremely challenging as we went through that with people being in their cabins for extended period of days, and I'm clearly very proud of the squadron and how they dealt with everything we went through. The lows were about where I expected them to be. Fatigue is probably the biggest one. It's living in that environment when you're not used to it. And it doesn't, even if you have when you have time off, you're still in your work environment. It's not like going home and switching the TV on and putting your feet up. You don't get that. You're in the lads are mostly in 6-man mess decks, which again is a lot better than it used to be in the dark old days. But it's still, when they're used to living in single accommodation on camp, whether Navy or RAF, and it's the same at Coldrose and places like that. And then you're into a 6-man mess deck. I'm massively impressed with how they dealt with that in general. I thought there would be more issues on that side. I was expecting around month 4 for it to be pretty low, because I'm not a psychologist, but we're all fairly used to being away for 3 to 4 months in a chunk. And then, so we're tuned to that. And sure enough, around the 4-month point, things were a little bit slower than we were hoping it to be, the 4 months from being away from home. And yeah, it was a difficult time for the whole team. So again, stopping in Guam for those 2 weeks was really useful. We've learned a huge amount out of it.
That's really eye-opening. Having been on Illustrious as a young officer when the GR7s and 9s were flying back in 2009, and seeing the air group, the strike wing, come in and fit seamlessly into the ship, and the number of personnel, I find that really interesting. And actually, it speaks to a problem, I would say, probably across defence, in that we want to be so efficient, we've cut out all of the fat, and you're into this really lean space where people will get fatigued. And I think that's something, if you are talking about sustainability, that's the piece of the puzzle, and the lived experience comes into this. Because if people are fatigued, you aren't going to have sustainable right. Plotting. You go for short bursts, recover, and then you go again. So that's absolutely fascinating. Mark, I'm very, very aware that it is half an hour of your time, and that we've really hit that mark. That has been a really fascinating discussion. It's been really eye-opening, and I think it's been really frank and candid in places. Love to have this discussion again if that's possible.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for that. And it's been a real pleasure chatting to you today.
Likewise. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Mark. A Call to Arms is part of the Military Sciences Profession of Arms programme. The show is produced by Peppy Van Arnen and Chris Jones and is sponsored by Airbus. If you enjoyed the show, please rate it and leave a review. Your feedback helps us tailor future interviews to what you, our audience, want to know. RUSI is a membership organisation, and it is thanks to our members and sponsors that we are able to maintain our independence, challenge orthodoxy, and deliver groundbreaking thought leadership. If you consider yourself to be connected to the profession of arms, then perhaps membership is for you. You can find more information at rusi.org/membership. For less than the price of a good cocktail each month, you can join a growing global community with exclusive access to events, research, and insights that put you ahead of your peers. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to welcoming you back next month for more from A Call to Arms.